saraband from the second Suite for Cello by Johann Sebastian Bach. Good evening. My name is Bridget Carey, and I'm a viola player. I've been invited by the Institute of Modern Languages Research to offer some reflection on the subject of music and language. And I will, at the end of the talk, do my best to answer any questions that you may send. On receiving this invitation, I pondered for quite a long time as to how to interpret it. Music and language. Music is a language. It's definitely a language in its own right. It has its own syntax, it has its own vocabulary, its dialects, its traditions, oral and written. Or how about music and language? How about Italian? I speak a number of languages tolerably well, but I'm afraid Italian really isn't one of them. On the other hand, in my daily existence, from day to day, I use two forms of Italian, I would say, on a daily basis. One of them is culinary Italian, and the other one is musical Italian. And my culinary Italian, I guess, will do well enough to negotiate me around the grocery store and the coffee shop. But my musical Italian is an extraordinary thing. I use it to define concepts, not only of tempo and dynamic, as you might expect, but nuance, articulation, mood, many frankly quite hard to pin down layers of interpretation, and that is more or less regardless of the nationality of the composer who wrote the instructions on the page, or the century in which the piece was written. I reckon there's a whole talk there. Or maybe I should talk about the aspect of musical language which most affects me in my daily practice. So as I say, I'm a freelance viola player and I live in London. So that covers rather a multitude of sins, but at the core of my practice is the performance of contemporary chamber music. And to that end, I spend a lot of my working life talking with composers and looking at their texts. So those composers, they might be schoolchildren, students, right up to peers of the realm, and on occasion mistresses of the Queen's music. Yeah. But that interaction is one of the things that fascinates me most about music. The whole business of the way we encode the musical concept in notation, and how at the other end, the unwrapping, the interpretation of the text and releasing the musical concept back into the air. And that's surely something that a linguist can identify with. So in the end I thought, well, there are all these different aspects of music and language, and I'll take you through a few of them. And in order to illustrate that, I will play a selection of the repertoire I've been living with since the lockdown. It's probably the repertoire my neighbours have heard an awful lot of. So to that end, I make absolutely no apology with starting with the solo string repertoire of Johann Sebastian Bach. I pretty much defy any classically trained string player to say that left alone with their own four walls and their instrument, as we were, to say that they haven't spent a lot of time with this solo repertoire. So why is that, I asked myself. The solo violin sonatas and partitas date from 1721, when Bach was Kapellmeister at the court in Curtin. And he played the violin there. I always think of him as a keyboard player, but he played the violin, and part of his duties required him to write a lot of instrumental music. And the cello suites followed in the next few years. We don't have a date for the cello suites because we no longer have the manuscript, the original manuscript. But we have many early sources, and the most important of which is a copy made by his wife Anna Magdalena. The sets belong together, the violin pieces and the cello pieces, and they represent a culmination, in my opinion. I think it's important to remember that Bach wasn't in his lifetime regarded as a musical pioneer. I think rather his peers may have thought of him as quite retrospective. He didn't rush to embrace the new classical language, the one that his composer sons made their own. And the other thing I think important to think is that although what I would call in this talk the modern violin family, that is the violin, the viola, the cello and the double bass, although they were still in Bach's time in the process of becoming established, superseding the consort of viols, the old string technology as it were, they were well on that way. So by 1721, there'd been 100 years of composition for the solo violin. And that would include virtuoso compositions, such as those of Corelli maybe, and deeply innovative and exploratory work, such as that of Bieber. So what is it about the Bach solo repertoire that's so important? Well, he goes the extra, and in a way I think his pieces sum up the fundamental musical language for the four-stringed instrument tuned in fifths. They explore to the very last degree the melodic, harmonic, the polyphonic possibilities for the solo stringed instrument. And as such, they've turned into a vital pedagogic tool in later centuries. So you simply don't learn the violin without learning violin language from learning the Bach pieces. And the cello suites complement the violin pieces. They draw from a slightly different tradition, from, I think, of the viola da gamba suites of Marais, for instance, and arguably also the long tradition by that time of writing dance suites for solo lute. And they are largely dance forms, but they extend the envelope of the dance, and they suggest polyphony in an extraordinarily sophisticated manner, quite different from the violin pieces, but extraordinarily sophisticated. Also, they create vivid character pieces. And these are all the characteristics that were recognised a century later by composers who were well established in the classical language and who were moving forward into what we now call the Romantic era. And they looked back at Bach's oeuvre and saw in his work the possibility to follow on from late Baroque language into a whole new mode of musical expression. After the job at Curtin, Bach moved to Leipzig and he worked for the Archbishop there, and a lot of his work then was text-based. It was choral music, the cantatas, the large-scale choral works that we that we associate with Bach, steeped in the speech rhythms of the German language and the vernacular Lutheran liturgy. But I think you can hear the technique that was honed in those instrumental pieces, the Brandenburg concertos, the suites, the sonatas, the way he took on those forms and extended the phrases. You can hear that going on further to its glorious conclusion in the large-scale choral works of the later period. Those of you paying attention will say, well, she said she was a viola player, and here she is, she's talking about works for violin, she's talking about works for cello. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the viola a bit later on. Suffice it to say that being the ugly sister of the modern violin family sort of has its compensations. So when it comes to Bach's repertoire, without too much damage to either footwear or my toes, I can slip on the enchanted slipper and enjoy playing sonatas and partitas and suites to my heart's content. So to illustrate that, I will give you one more dance movement from the same cello suite, in fact, from the second cello suite, the Allemande. Promised you some of my lockdown repertoire. Gosh, back there at the end of March, I was in the process of preparing performing material for a large-scale work by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. Sternenklang, literally the noise of the stars. It was first performed in 1971, and its English subtitle, Park Music for 21 Musicians, gives you an inkling into its perfect suitability for performance in the summer of 2020. Unfortunately, the 21 musicians are divided into 5 quartets with an indispensable percussionist at the centre. The initial lockdown meant that we couldn't even meet in our individual quartets to rehearse. So the first performance that was scheduled for May got postponed. It was an international cast, 9 musicians, including myself, from the Birmingham Contemporary Music Group, 8 from Das Neue Ensemble, based in Hanover, and 4 wonderful voices from Nordic Voices in Oslo. We did get to perform a bit later on. The delay meant that I had a little bit more time than I would have had under normal circumstances to spend preparing the material. The score can be performed by more or less any combination of singers or instrumentalists, so there's quite a lot of preparation that each participant has to get and do their homework to realise musical material for their particular instrument or voice. Integral to the structure of the piece are a number of melodies, which Stockhausen called the Modelle. He generated his musical material from observation of the constellations, and also by using a system that he had devised for an earlier piece, a vocal work called Stimmung. And with this system, he translated the vowel sounds of the International Phonetic Alphabet into pitches. And I just thought this might be interesting to a community of linguists. So the melodies use the name of each constellation and translate it into pitch in conjunction with characterisation of the star sign. So to best illustrate this, I think I'll show you a few of the melodies as they're notated in the score. Might even, if my cameraman can, here they are. This is group 3 melodies. You'll see a number of star signs, and you might even be able to pick out mostly the vowels from the names of the constellations in phonetic pitch. So this is the performing material I started out with. Effectively, Stockhausen analysed the overtones produced by the different embouchures used to pronounce each vowel sound. Just pop that down again. And he devised a notation for it. So my singer colleagues could effectively sing the vowels over a given fundamental pitch, and the resulting overtones will produce the melody. That's a little thumbnail sketch of the principles of overtone singing. I'm not going to demonstrate that because I'm really not a singer. Eventually, in performance, in order for me to be able to produce the fundamental pitch and the overtone melody, my sound was filtered electronically. And then I was equipped with a terribly, terribly clever piece of coding and a foot pedal whereby I could select the desired overtones. During the lockdown, I had time to learn the melodies, just as melodies, and think how I could play them best on the viola, and crucially, devise ways to add the character and the articulation which bring them to life. So I'll just play you 2 or 3 of them. Here is Sculptor. Sculptor is just a 2-note melody devised from the U and the O sound. Sculptor. Goes a bit like this, perhaps. can sort of hear him up there, can't you? Chipping away with this chisel. Each melody has a little B section. Sculptor's B section uses the consonants. So you hear the sk and the sculptor. So, but although he finds that he's using the hard consonant sounds, Stockhausen labels the B section piano. So I think the image I had in my mind was brushing away the marble dust. So I had to find a way of making the consonants. One of my favourite modella is Triangulum, and it's a lilting melody created from those three distinct vowel sounds, E, A, U. And I've tried to characterise this one with a sort of shiny, sparkly quality, a bit like an orchestral triangle in the sky. And you can hear that the B section, he specifically asks for high tones. I'll play a little bit of the A and B section. Just go round and round. Lastly, I'm going to play Sagittarius. You can hear him striding across the skies, drawing his bow. But in the B section, you can hear the clatter of his hooves as he clatters into a gallop. So in the B section, all the vowels come in. So those who are singing, you can hear Sagittarius, Sagittarius. We did get to perform Steinklein at the end of August in that wonderful, wonderful surroundings of the Berg Garden, which is the botanic garden in the Herrenhäuser Gardens in Hanover. And the work lasts for between 2.5 and 3 hours. And as the sun set, our audience scattered through the gardens in a perfectly socially distanced manner were able to look up and actually see the constellations that we were playing, which was rather joyous for all of us, especially after such a long time with no public performance. Stockhausen believed that music is a universal language. Not only a language that can unite peoples, he truly, truly believed that it was a way of reaching out with a message of peace to the cosmos. And that was his philosophy. And I think it's interesting in a piece like this, where you see a mid-20th century composer using words to generate pitch material for the piece. And then if you think back to Bach, he would have used words from his text to set out and to draw out his melodic line. And the composition and the language are inextricably linked and intertwined, even when you're playing instrumental music, even when you're not using the text as such, the connection is so often there. I think I want to talk a little bit about the viola. Back in the time of Bach, there was really no solo repertoire for the viola. It was very much an ensemble instrument, and it's the middle fiddle. Arguably, I guess, if we think to what I was saying about the consort of viols, the viola might be said to take on the role of more than one of those middle fiddles. But it was still very much an instrument for the ensemble and not a soloist. And in the classical and the Romantic eras, there are occasional pieces and there are even concertos. But the core of the viola's repertoire is ensemble, notably in chamber music. It was, however, the string instrument of choice for a fair number of notable composers. Mozart played it, and so did Beethoven. You might say, well, they were keyboard players, weren't they? So maybe they picked a string instrument where they didn't have to do anything terribly difficult. I like to think that there's another good reason for picking the viola, and that is that even in a chamber ensemble or in a larger orchestra, if you're playing the viola, you're in the thick of it, in the thick of the musical argument. And that's quite a good place to be if you're a composer and you're thinking about musical argument. Both Mozart and Beethoven developed the viola's voice in their chamber music. And with the development of middle voices came the evolution of, unarguably, the most sophisticated chamber ensemble, and that's the string quartet. You can hear in Mozart and Beethoven's work how challenging the viola parts were in as they developed their style. It became more so. And although viola writing continued to be more complex in chamber and orchestral music throughout the 19th century, it really wasn't until the 20th century that the instrument started to attract a solo repertoire of any great body. That was often the instigation of individual players. I think of Lionel Curtis or William Primrose. A new repertoire was commissioned in earnest. Virtuoso viola players are still doing that. Tabea Zimmermann commissions a lot of new work, and our own Lawrence Power is at the moment making it his absolute business to commission as many new viola concertos as possible. There was also in the 20th century, there were one or two notable composers for whom the viola was really their first instrument, though not second to the keyboard. Rebecca Clark and Paul Hindemith. I think more generally, composers love the intimacy of the viola's voice. Little bit of technical aside here. I share 3 strings with the violin. I don't have the high E string and I have a low C string, but 3 of the strings are the same, so the viola is tuned 1 octave above the cello. Now, in order to make the viola sound as bright as the violin, with this tuning, the physics of it would mean that the instrument would be so big it would be unwieldy to play. So its covered and intimate voice is as a result of the physics of the thing. But in a funny sort of way, I think it lends itself to solo repertoire in the modern era. Composers love the humanity of its voice. We do have a lot of pastorals, sad songs, but it's not exclusive. I think in the work of Luciano Berio, for instance, he writes a wonderful elegiac pastoral viola part for his folk songs, and then when he got to write the solo piece for the viola, it's the sequenza, it's full of fireworks and rage. So we have a good balance. Now this brings me to the last piece in my programme, as it were, today, that last piece I'm going to play from, and that's the Viola Sonata by George Ligeti. Ligeti was born in Transylvania in 1923, and language was a preoccupation from his very earliest years. His childhood home was one of those places that was variously belonged to Hungary or to Romania in the interwar years, and it was an absolute melting pot of languages. And as a child, he invented his own that was detailed to the extent of writing a dictionary. I think that stood him in good stead in his later career. In his opera, Le Grand Macabre, he makes use of invented language as part of his libretto. So for him, I think language and musical language always went hand in hand. If you think, I don't think I've ever heard a piece of George Ligeti, you're probably wrong. The haunting choral music, which accompanies the scene where they discover the obelisk in Kubrick's film 2001: A Space Odyssey. That's Ligeti. It was taken originally without the composer's permission from his Requiem of 1965. I think he came to an arrangement. He was quite a good businessman, Ligeti. He came to an arrangement with Mr. Kubrick, and in the end. And there's also an orchestral piece, Atmosphere, which you can hear a little bit of towards the end of the film. And that densely interwoven, layered texture, they were a feature of his style from that period. The Viola Sonata dates from the 1990s. Originally, there were 2 or 3 sort of occasional pieces for viola, and he drew them together and made them into a large-scale sonata in 1994, I think. One of the reasons why it was my lockdown project, because I played the occasional pieces and had never learnt all the bits. So that's one of the reasons why I spent some time with it. In that period, after the Grand Opera, in a way that many composers would, he took the end of a big project as an opportunity to address his language and to go in slightly different directions, and I think that's quite a common thing, probably. He returned to folk music that he'd studied as a young man to help him develop his musical language in a different direction. And I think it's quite interesting to hear the solo pieces, the small pieces, where that process is going on, to understand his later style, which is quite different from his earlier style. I like to think that you can hear not only the dance rhythms, but also the speech rhythms of Eastern Europe in some of the phrases. I'd like first to play the Hora Longa, which is forms the first movement of the sonata. Ligeti writes that in the Horolunga he evokes the spirit of Romanian folk music. Although the hora is a dance, in the Romanian tradition these are sung folk melodies, nostalgic and melancholy, richly ornamented. He uses a microtonal inflection taken from the natural partials of the harmonic series, so most noticeably flattened seventh, which adds to the folk-like quality. This is a piece that was written for German viola player Tobias Zimmermann. And this movement is all played on the lowest string, the C string. It uses its entire length and exploits the varying tone qualities found in the different tessituras. Commenting on this, Ligeti wrote that the C string had a unique acerbity, compact, hoarse, with the aftertaste of wood, earth and tannic acid. lunga. I hope I've coherently defined some aspects of musical language this evening. I think, yes, I think I've got time for a little aside in the form of a bit of a family anecdote. My daughter takes composition lessons at the junior department of the Royal College of Music, which is usually a Saturday school bustling with young musicians all doing their thing. This summer, in the summer term, was reduced to an online resource, and the young composers were encouraged to bend their minds to harnessing the new technology in their compositions. And a whole generation of Zoom-friendly chamber pieces was born. Music really does have the same communicative function as language. And the limitations of that video call, the delay caused by the latency, the infuriating way that the line cuts out when two voices speak at once, leading either to excessive politeness or to, at the very least, an altered view of rhythm. Music will rise to those challenges, just as language has adapted to the era of the tweet and the text message. Chamber music is a conversation, and our conversations must be had, even in a time of distance. I'd like to finish by playing the final movement of Ligeti's Viola Sonata. The title is Chacun chromatique, and took fright a little bit because chacun solo music, solo string music, evokes the spirit of the great Johann Sebastian Bach, and he writes that his piece is much more unassuming than the famous chacun. And then he adds, somewhat disingenuously, I think, that my music cannot sustain monumental forms. So I beg to differ. I think Ligeti's music can sustain monumental forms. This just doesn't happen to be one of them. It's a wild dance, and it's rough in places, really rough. And like much of the sonata, it's concerned with all the chordal possibilities, the possibilities of playing more than one note at the same time. And you hear the chromaticism of the title, Chacun chromatique. You hear that sort of darting through the texture. It's actually, I get the score out, it's a fine example of the use of musical Italian. Oh, there I am, spoiling my husband's camera angle. There we go. So there's the initial indication, vivace appassionato, molto ritmico e feroce. But then there's lots of interim Italian, so underneath the score Italian as well. I'm to start misterioso. And at the climax of the movement, it's tutta forza, tutta la forza, grandioso, and then intenso. And in the final passage, as at the final part of the first movement, it's marked da lontano, as the wild nature subsides and it leaves a plaintive echo. And I hope that you might hear in this very, very late 20th century dance movement the echo of J.S. Bach and of that fundamental string language I spoke of earlier. Bye.